Organized gang warfare in the late Roman Republic. His exploits caused the Forum to be soaked with blood and led to armed conflict in the streets, becoming a part of daily life in ancient Rome. To a republican government that was already outdated, Claudius helped deliver the final death blow. His actions showed the flaws of the Roman Republic and ultimately necessitated the rise of dictators such as Pompey and Caesar, who could restore order. Mob violence had always played an important role in the Republic. In the late Republic, it was much more evident. Demagogues such as Gracchi and Saturnius based their power on the support of the Roman proletariat, which was politically emasculated, but physically a force to deal with. However, the organized gangs that Claudius and his opponent Milo used were unprecedented. We can see the significance of these gangs by looking briefly at the history of Claudius himself, the nature of the coalition he assembled, and at the reign of violence he brought to the city of Rome and its effects. Born Publius Pulcher Claudius, Claudius changed the spelling of his last name from Claudius to Claudius to reflect the plebeian pronunciation of his name. Claudius's early political career is known only in fragments. Surprisingly, he, like many of the young nobles who would later join him, was from an Optimate family, Rome's conservative party. Claudius's father was one of Sulla's patrician officers and died fighting for Sulla at the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BCE, leaving Claudius to be raised by his older brother, Appius Pulcher Claudius. In 70 BCE, Claudius joined his brother-in-law Lucullus as an officer in Lucullus's army against Mithridates. While serving under his brother-in-law, Claudius started a mutiny from the headquarters of the army. Declaring himself the soldier's friend, Claudius successfully encouraged the soldiers to rebel by contrasting Lucullus's tightness with the spoils of war to Pompey's reputed generosity. Lucullus was unable to continue the war on account of his brother-in-law, and Claudius soon found himself unwelcome. Claudius transferred to the army of his other brother-in-law and had many adventures, such as joining the Syrian army against the Arabs or being captured by pirates, before returning to Rome in 65 BCE. Claudius became the leader of what Cicero described as a gang of young incorrigibles. These youths from powerful families were involved in drinking and playing dice. They seemed almost to desire that their actions would shock respectable Rome. Among Claudius's gang were Mark Antony and Curio, both of whom would later become rising political stars on their own. Although Claudius and his company loved to shock their fellow citizens, Claudius was unprepared for the backlash that followed his most outrageous stunt. Claudius disguised himself as a woman and attended the Bona Dea, Good Goddess festival. For a man to attend this festival was a sacrilege that the Romans were terrified would upset the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. When Claudius was found out, he was attacked by a mob of furious women and barely made his escape. Since Julius Caesar was Pontifex Maximus at the time, the festival had been held at his house. It was rumored that Claudius was having an affair with Caesar's wife. Caesar divorced his wife because of this, but appears to have held no grudge against Claudius. Claudius was brought to trial for his sacrilege, but insisted he was innocent, since he had been in Interamna on the day in question, 50 miles away from Rome. Cicero destroyed Claudius's alibi by revealing that Claudius had visited him on that same day. Claudius was acquitted, but he never forgave Cicero. Desirous of increased political power, Claudius wanted to get elected into the tribune of plebs. However, since he was a patrician, he was ineligible. With the help of Julius Caesar, acting as Pontifex Maximus, Claudius arranged to have himself adopted into a plebeian family. Claudius was elected as a tribune just as he desired. Claudius made it clear he was out to get Cicero from his new position of power. During the Catiline conspiracy, Cicero, as consul, had put to death Roman citizens without a trial. Claudius hoped to condemn him for this. Without waiting to see what Claudius would do to him, Cicero fled into voluntary exile. As a tribune, Claudius worked to increase his power base. He succeeded in passing 2 bills, one of which reconstituted the collegia, previously outlawed in 64 BCE, and allowed the formation of new collegia. The second bill provided free grain to all citizens, dramatically increasing Claudius's support with the urban poor. Despite Optimate criticism, Claudius opened up the Temple of Castor to registration in the new collegia. Despite his adventurism and the instability of the coalition he assembled, Claudius represented Caesar's most effective ally. However, regardless of how useful Claudius was, Caesar was soon to regret the support he had lent to him. Whilst it is true that each of the triumvirate at various times hoped to use Claudius for his own ends, the fact remains that of the tribune's programs, the fact remains that the tribune's program was one of his own construction to suit his own ambition for dominance. Once Caesar left for Gaul, Claudius was unleashed. Pompey and Caesar were becoming unpopular, and Claudius saw this as a chance to switch his allegiance. Claudius picked apart some of Caesar's legislation, but as a self-declared champion of the people, his primary target was Pompey. Pompey and Crassus were competing with each other. Claudius supported Crassus in this competition in return for interest-free loans from the richest man in Rome. Claudius undermined Pompey's treaties in the east, attacked him verbally, and even had his thugs assault Pompey in public. Soon, Pompey would not even leave his house because of Claudius. The worst insult of all concerned the son of Tigranes, who was a hostage Pompey had brought back from the east. He was kept captive in the house of Praetor Lucius Flavius. Claudius liberated the captive, and when Flavius tried to recapture him, a battle was fought outside the city gates. Claudius was ultimately successful, but not without heavy losses on both sides. In retaliation, Pompey gave his support to Titus Annius Milo, an impoverished nobleman who would soon become Claudius's worst enemy. Milo formed his own gang to counteract that of Claudius, and thereafter, until the death of Claudius in 52 BCE, the streets of Rome were filled with blood as the two rival gangs battled each other for control. Before proceeding further, it is worthwhile to examine the nature of Claudius's support, as well as that of Milo's. Claudius's supporters were mostly the urban poor, recruited through the collegia, and organized either by professions, guilds, or district. Claudius's gang consisted largely of slaves, but included a large number of freemen and urban poor. Of the latter, many were down and out, but many were also skilled men with trades who felt exploited by those who strived to maintain the status quo. Claudius had several other gang leaders to help him keep his men organized. Their names are given to us by Cicero, but little other information remains of them. The tactics of Claudius were unique to his time. Outside of the city lay proconsular armies that could have crushed Claudius and his gang. However, during the time of Republican Rome, the armies were not allowed inside the city boundaries. As long as the law was observed, and these armies could not enter Rome, Claudius's gangs were a force to be reckoned with. His gang was equivalent to a miniature army. Furthermore, Claudius was not interested in votes outside of the city of Rome, as both the Gracchi and Saturninus had been. Claudius pursued urban political power as an end to itself. Under these circumstances, the only way Claudius could have been opposed was by someone who raised a rival gang inside of the city, which is what Milo did. Milo's gang consisted not of dedicated volunteers, like that of Claudius's gang, but mostly gladiators he had bought. His success against Claudius's forces showed that a small group of professionals could be as satisfactory as Claudius's mass movement, where violence alone was required. Also, whereas Claudius only relied on those inside the city of Rome for support, Milo had men outside of Rome he could call in for support when he needed to. Because the activities of these gangs were legally defensible if it could be proved that the other gang had struck first, they were largely immune to the courts, although gang leaders were occasionally brought to trial. With two rival gangs now in place, the violence increased dramatically. Sympathy turned against Claudius, and many began to wish that Cicero was back in Rome to make trouble for him. When the question of Cicero's recall was discussed in 57 BCE, Claudius and his forces attacked the assembly, killing many. Cicero's younger brother, Quintus Cicero, escaped the slaughter only by hiding under a pile of corpses. The Senate continued to deliberate the question of Cicero, and when Claudius tried to stop them, Milo retaliated in kind. By midsummer, Claudius's forces were worn out, and the Senate was able to vote for Cicero's recall. Cicero returned and attached himself to Milo for support against Claudius. Since Cicero returned a hero, he was able to convince the Senate to destroy his house, which Claudius and his gang had destroyed, at public expense. Claudius and his company drove away the workers from Cicero's house and destroyed what was already there. Claudius also burned Quintus Cicero's house, and then went to storm Milo's property. After doing battle with Milo's forces, Claudius succeeded in setting fire to his house, but not before losing many of his men. Often, Claudius attacked Cicero directly with his gang, doing battle with Cicero's bodyguards. In one of these encounters, Claudius apparently got himself into a position where he was at the mercy of Cicero. But Cicero gave his bodyguard the signal to let Claudius go. Claudius ran for aedile in 56 BCE. Although Milo, as a tribune, tried to postpone the elections, he was unsuccessful. Claudius attempted to bring Milo to trial for using gladiators to defend himself, even though Claudius was guilty of this as well. Pompey tried to speak in Milo's defense, but he was constantly interrupted by personal abuse from Claudius. Claudius acted like a cheerleader with the crowd, shouting out, "Who is starving the people to death? Who wanted to be sent to Alexandria? Who is a dissolute general? Who scratches his head with one finger?" After each question, the crowd would shout out, "Pompeius!" Claudius then asked, "Whom do you want to go to Alexandria?" The crowd replied, "Crassus!" Pompey was forced to listen to these insults until Milo and his men rushed forward and chased Claudius off the rostra. Claudius continued his hostility toward Pompey, even going to the extent of plotting against his life. Pompey was irritated by Claudius and summoned more men from the country for his defense. The Senate did not like Claudius, but they liked Pompey even less, and so Claudius was allowed to continue his antics. Claudius's positions were always changing, however, making it hard for both his friends and enemies to know where he stood. Claudius's explosive political strands were combined with dramatic transfers of allegiance. By 54 BCE, Claudius shifted his alliance back to the triumvirs and reconciled himself to Pompey. The reasons for this drastic change of position are not clear. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that Pompey's son married Claudius's niece, the daughter of Appius Claudius. Despite his reconciliation to Pompey, Claudius and Milo remained bitter enemies. This had the effect of straining Pompey's relationship with Milo. Milo asked Pompey for more support, but Pompey promised him nothing, and increasingly began to distance himself from Milo. Pompey also claimed to have reconciled Cicero to Claudius. But the fact that relationships remained poor between the two cast doubt on the validity of this reconciliation. Also, in 54 BCE, one of Caesar's henchmen, Publius Vatinius, was put on trial for violence through the collegia and corruption. Cicero had by this point submitted to the triumvirs in return for their protection, and agreed to defend Vatinius. Claudius also came to Vatinius's aid, ascending the tribunal and scattering the lots for jurors. Vatinius was acquitted. In 53 BCE, Claudius decided to become a candidate for praetorship. In the same year, Milo ran for consul, feeling that the current chaos Rome was in would allow him to win despite his unorthodox methods. Claudius was terrified of the idea of his enemy obtaining the most powerful political position in Rome, and supported Hapsius as an opponent candidate to Milo. Claudius used all the violence and murder for which he was famous to try and stop Milo. Pompey may have even helped Claudius gather rustics and slaves from the Apennines. Claudius openly declared that Milo was going to be killed. Milo had already demonstrated he was able to play the same game, however. The two gangs continually fought it out in the streets of Rome, with elections being postponed repeatedly. As a result, the year 52 BCE began without any elected consuls, and the Senate had to appoint an interregnum to rule. In one of these battles in the Forum, Mark Antony, having long since left Claudius's gang, attacked his former leader with a sword. Claudius escaped only by barricading himself in the stairs of a nearby bookstore. Why Mark Antony did this is a mystery. Since Antony was without question Caesar's man at this point, it is hypothesized that Caesar, realizing that Claudius had once again gotten out of control, ordered his death. However, it was unlike Caesar to order an execution in the Forum in broad daylight. Another possibility is that Antony was acting on his own impulse in what he thought was Caesar's best interest. A third possibility is that Antony had a personal vendetta against Claudius. Claudius had accused Antony of having an affair with Claudius's wife Fulvia, who would in fact later marry Mark Antony after the death of both Claudius and her second husband, Curio. And if this is true, then perhaps Antony wanted Claudius out of the way. In any case, Antony was soon to see what good luck it was to fail. For if he had been responsible for the death of Claudius, it would certainly have ended his political career. On January 18, 52 BCE, Claudius and Milo met on the Appian Way, and Claudius was killed as a result. Exactly how it happened was never quite clear. Cicero claimed that Claudius was waiting in ambush for Milo, and when Milo and his escort passed through, Claudius and his thugs attacked them. In the course of the fight, Claudius was wounded and carried by some of his men to a nearby inn. Cicero claims that Milo, once he realized what happened to Claudius, was unsure of what to do. However, when realizing that he would be blamed for the murder either way, he sent his men into the inn to drag Claudius out. When they went into the inn, Claudius was already dead from his wounds, and so Milo was saved from his guilt. Other stories are not quite as sympathetic to Milo. Some claim that Milo initiated the battle. When Claudius was injured, Milo's men went into the inn, killed the innkeeper, dragged Claudius out, stabbed him several times, and left his corpse on the road. Another version is that Claudius and Milo passed each other with their escort without incident. Then, one of Milo's men managed to slip into Claudius's gang, and after following Claudius for a while, stabbed him in the back. Whatever the case, once Claudius was dead, his wife Fulvia sent runners throughout the city to alert the people of his death. That same night, a large crowd gathered outside of Claudius's house, and Fulvia's lamentation excited the crowd. After Fulvia, the multitudes were further riled up by the speeches of two tribunes, Titus Municius Plancus and Quintus Pompeius Rufus. The city of Rome was soon to see how much the people valued their champion. A huge crowd carried Claudius's body through the streets and into the Senate house. Claudius was carried naked so as to show his wounds. Then the whole Senate house was burned down as a funeral pyre for Claudius. Anarchy reigned in Rome following the death of Claudius. many optimates were murdered, as well as any well-dressed person foolish enough to be caught walking in the streets. The commoners raged through the city, beating and murdering all whom they suspected of sympathy with their hero's murderer, and wreaked their fury on the rich, attacking especially those who wore fine clothes and gold rings. Milo was prudent enough to stay hidden for most of the ordeal. But when he was convinced to make a speech in his defense, a riot ensued. Milo escaped only by disguising himself as a slave. Lepidus's house was besieged, and his family saved only by Milo's gladiators. Claudius's relative, Sextus Claudius, assumed leadership of the gang. He led them on an attack of Milo's house, but they were driven off by the arrows from Milo's defenders. The Senate, in desperation, decided to vote Pompey an unprecedented and illegal sole consulship with power to raise troops and restore order. Because of the circumstances, even strict constitutionalists, such as Cato, approved the measure. Although other consuls were later appointed, Pompey was to retain this power in fact, if not in name, until the civil war with Caesar. In an effort to maintain order, Pompey implemented many laws that were thought by Caesar's allies to be indirectly against Caesar, and this helped to hasten the civil war. Cicero undertook the defense of Milo. Cicero wrote a speech defending Milo, but never delivered it. Despite the protection of Pompey's soldiers, Cicero was so intimidated by the howling crowds that he broke down and was unable to deliver his speech. Even if Cicero's nerves had not failed him, the mob probably would have yelled him down and not let him deliver his speech anyways. There was frequent violence between the crowd and Pompey's soldiers throughout the trial, and many of the crowd was killed. In the end, Milo was ultimately condemned and exiled. Claudius's politics were far from orthodox, and the rules of his game were much different than the rules of Caesar and Pompey. But for a period of time, it can be said that he was the most powerful man in Rome. That Claudius's methods could be so successful demonstrates the frustration of the urban poor in Rome, and should be taken as a sign that the Republic was on its way out. Claudius hastened this departure. The anarchy he created in the city was only restored by giving Pompey sole power, which was one of the factors leading to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, and Caesar's eventual dictatorship. Also, the reign of violence Claudius unleashed on the city of Rome caused both rich and poor to wish for law and order as opposed to freedom under the Republic. Claudius is certainly one of history's most colorful characters. He took mob violence to an extreme no one had done before him, and his effects on history remain visible.